Great to have everybody back after lunch, and I hope you enjoyed the food, the fresh air, the break, the chance to chat, the chance to relax, whatever it may be. We're now going to talk about an issue which has come up a few times, which is about how we fund some of this work. How do we get the sectors to work together? How do we get the money to work together? Some of the panellists may have missed the question at the beginning. What would we do if we had £1 billion to spend on this? You are, of course, welcome to give that £1 billion today. And to secure all those commitments, I'm going to hand you over back to Andrew Jack, who needs no further introduction. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much. Is the mic working? Yeah. Great. So welcome back. So we have about an hour, and our discussion this afternoon is cross-sectoral and financial support for global education. We have a sort of partly a funders panel here, don't we, amongst others. Anya Vinolds, going from Leverhulme Trust, Joe Johnson, of course, Garji Ghosh, I think, is with us. Yep, here she is. Remote from London, I think, Garji. Yep. And Laura Savage from the International Education Funders Group. So I think what we'll do is we'll do please also post, including online reminder, your questions, and we'll get to those in the second half. But perhaps we might go around initially for a first round of reflections really on kind of, I suppose, reflections on funding and priorities around this question of education. And what are the priorities and what are the opportunities perhaps that each of you are seeing in this area? And then we'll come back and we'll look at some specific areas, including Edtech, for example. Anna, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here, not least because I used to be a fellow at Duke, so it's really lovely to be back. I think what COVID has done, as we've said already, is simply...
Oh, sorry.
Is that better? Sorry.
Yeah,
my voice is obviously not as loud as yours. Sorry about that. I think what COVID has done, most of all, is, as we've said this morning, reveal inequalities in education that pre-existed. But I think it's done a few more things. I think it's taught us that schools don't just teach children. They look after them, they nurture them. But in particular, vulnerable children, and by that I mean children particularly in low-income situations, have been particularly badly affected. And I think we need to just think about why that is. That is because school and education, in many ways, is their lifeline and the support that they can't get at home. Now, don't get me wrong, if you go into a low-income setting, whether it's in the global north or the global south, it's really clear there is no shortage of aspiration, and parents care, and parents want their children to be educated. But at the same time, some parents and households and communities are much less able to support children than others, and that's a key role for schools. And so my overarching lesson from this pandemic is, when things got bad, schools slipped down the policy agenda, schools slipped down the funding agenda. Certainly funding for schools and education in low-income countries slipped down the funding agenda. So for me, the big lesson is, are we serious about making long-term investments in education? And if we are, we need to get funding education back up front and centre. And it's much easier, I think, as Boris was saying earlier, easy is the wrong word. It's easy to get drawn into funding health when we should be thinking about funding education. Now, in terms of the specifics of what we fund, we'll probably come on to that later, but I'll let others.
No, but why don't you...
Okay.
Funding is very important.
Okay, funding is important. And there's another wrinkle to this. I mean, not only have we learnt that schools play a wider role than just teaching people, we've also learnt that within countries, the experience of children is wildly different, and that applies in the global south too. Obviously, the scale is entirely different, global north, global south. But if we take, the UK, the US, other countries in the global north, the difference between the poorest children and the richest children is very stark. And they're quite interesting settings to think about, because in theory, there shouldn't be a lack of resource, right? And yet we have these stark inequalities. And to me, that speaks to targeting and prioritization. We need to put more resource, carefully applied, and we can talk about that in a minute, into the communities, the households that are the lowest income. And we don't do that. And that's why we have stark inequalities, starker in some countries than others. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that you can't fix the world's problems with an education system, right? Poverty, time that parents have, how households run, gender relations, all these things impact on how a child will learn and develop. And we need to be really careful, so those of us who are educationalists are very guilty of this, of trying to fix everything with the education system, and that's just not possible. So in the context of the UK, which I've researched a lot on, unless we do something about income disparities, we're going to be fighting an uphill battle when it comes to education. And you could make that exact same argument on the global scale in terms of low-income countries. So I'll stop there, otherwise hogging the mic.
Okay. Joe, so we've talked a lot already today about foundational learning, early years, preschool even, but I think you're quite interested in looking at the intersection perhaps with the higher and further education, the older groups.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Great to be back at Jesus. I think the government came into power in December 2019, with two big ideas. It had the Global Britain idea, which was to try and put some shape to what Britain's post-Brexit identity was going to be on the world stage. And it had a domestic-facing agenda, which was called the Levelling Up Agenda. Then the pandemic struck, and we had a third new idea enter the government's sort of ideas box, and that was about building back better. And all three of those ideas have a big bearing on what happens in our education system and in our research system, and they're not always working together in the same direction. When I look at science, for example, what's happening in R&D, clearly there is a direction of travel that has seen us take money out of the science budget that was being diverted via DFID for ODA purposes, and that's been a source of considerable concern. I'm sure you've been discussing that this morning. That was one of our big sort of tools for British influence in overseas development and in ensuring equitable development. That's been cut, and there's in a shift towards the levelling up agenda, some of those funds are being diverted towards addressing our regional productivity gaps in the UK. So there's a political imperative to try and shift more of that high-quality innovation funding towards parts of the country that have traditionally received less of it. So there's an example of Global Britain and levelling up being somewhat in tension. Building back better, clearly, as Anna says, is now central, and I think it all does begin in the classroom. Building back better has to start in the classroom, and we've seen governments address some of the challenges that the pandemic has revealed with additional funding. Obviously, not as much as many people have been calling for, but there is considerable increase in resources going towards our education budget. It is not going to be going into higher education. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The priority for the government, as for previous governments, has been the mandatory part of the education system, so early years, primary, secondary, and very much not the tertiary, or certainly not the sort of the level 6 and above end of the tertiary system. The big priority politically is in ensuring that more money goes into schools, and especially that more money goes into technical and vocational education, reaching those parts of the country that is sort of central to the levelling up agenda. So I think for higher education, it's very much a mixed bag, the combination of these three ideas. Potentially, universities should be at the very heart, and our science community should be at the very heart of the Global Britain agenda. The need, however, to divert resources towards levelling up rather takes away some of the firepower that they would have at their disposal to make a reality of that.
And just actually, while we're talking about the UK position, because there was quite a lot of debate, wasn't there, around the formula for reallocating to schools, which critics said, kind of was perhaps often going even to leafier suburbs, even if they were in, kind of more rural, northern areas or other areas that have been a bit underfunded in the past. I mean, do you think there's enough transparency, and is the sort of redistribution mechanism sufficiently equity-driven now?
Redistribution mechanism between...
Thinking about allocations pupil per head, for example, and how much goes to primary and secondary schools.
Well, it's a closely contested formula, and every time it's reconfigured, it's a cause of great turbulence in the system, and no formula generates more heat in Westminster than this one, and it's one which Secretaries of State tamper with at their peril, because it creates winners and losers, and it's very difficult to make everybody happy at the same time from observation.
And just one final thing, but thinking about the the global development budget, as it were. Again, obviously you're not you're not responsible for the government policy, but reallocations of aid and so on. Any thoughts about how that will play out in terms of the tension between global Britain and the trading imperative, let's say, versus some of the most excluded children and countries? Will there be a sort of a shift again that might not go to those the most deserving, those with greatest need, but perhaps in poorer areas where there's less scope for mutual trade benefit, for example?
Well, I was struck during the debate over that the ODA commitment earlier this year by the amount of support that it actually had with within the Conservative Party. Because from my experience, there was no commitment, no legislative commitment that was more unpopular with the grassroots activists of the Conservative Party. So those MPs who did take a stand on it were very much doing so at their own political peril. And to that extent, their bravery is to be commended, because it would have come at some considerable political cost to them in their own basis. As to the long-term outlook for that commitment, I think the government does want to get back to a position where it's able to meet this 0.7% target. Clearly, there are other priorities for the time being, and there are special fiscal circumstances.
So, Gargi, let's hear from Gargi. Let's hear from you. Give us a sense of what your priorities are going forwards around this issue of equity in education, both within the US, of course. Gates has got a big program, but also globally.
Sure. Thanks, Andrew. Good morning from Washington. The Gates Foundation is a relative newcomer to global education. As you say, we've been working in US education for 20 years. If you'll let me start on a personal note, our global education work has benefited immensely from the thinking and advice of a colleague and friend who passed away last week, Yidan Prize. And the only thing that exceeded his commitment to analytics and a technical understanding of this field was his overwhelming commitment that every belief that every child could learn. So that very much inspires our approach here. The gross inequalities in learning outcomes that we see predate the pandemic. Two statistics drive the way I think about priorities in this work. First, in high-income countries, we know that about 9 out of 10 aged 10-year-olds can read. In low-income countries, that's 1 out of 10. 1 out of 10 10-year-olds. The second accompanying fact is that most of those kids are actually in school or claim they are. And so we have a learning problem, and this makes us focus on foundational literacy and numeracy as the goal. The pandemic has set all of that back, but we know not evenly. Inequality in learning outcomes, we know in both the US and internationally, is driven by poverty, location, and gender, in that order. And we see all of that playing out. High poverty schools in the US are seeing 3x the learning losses as low poverty schools. We know rural Ethiopia is seeing far worse setbacks than urban. And gender is mixed. In Pakistan, boys have done worse. In South Africa, girls have done worse. So that's a bit of a complicated picture. I think now what this means is that we are more than ever going to need to focus investments on the right things. There's too much been set back by the pandemic to do everything all at once. And in this field, it really means we should care about funding what works. We don't have enough data. We don't use it enough to know that our interventions are reaching our policy goals, are targeting the inequities, are actually improving learning. So we need to invest in the data, and more importantly, we need to use it in adjusting the interventions that we support. And we should be focusing now on funding the scale up of what works. We know in education there are approaches that have proven to succeed. That's sort of integrated programming across assessments, curriculum, teacher training. We know that meeting kids where they are, assessment-informed instruction works. And so as we look to prioritize as funders and policymakers, I think we need to really focus on investing in proven interventions at scale. Thanks.
So data and interventions with potential to scale at the high level. Any lessons learned from the US domestic, any lessons learned from the US domestic education program to sort of transfer or to not transfer? I know, for example, there was a focus on charter schools, so a sort of institutional governance level type of intervention. Is that something that you're now sort of shifting away from, or using or not using in your learnings and reflections on your global education policy?
Yeah, so a couple of themes that have already been raised resonate very much for me. Two I would point to. One, the need to break down silos. We know that it's an ecosystem around children that actually supports education success. And two, that it is a package of interventions that actually improves learning outcomes. So on the first, we know that everything from maternal nutrition to after-school programs and the supports around girls, kids in general, but certainly girls transitioning to secondary school, that life cycle approach to education and to supporting kids, especially kids in poverty, has a dramatic effect on education outcomes, certainly in the US and internationally. Second, when it comes to the classroom itself, we and many others have sought the sort of the singular intervention that would change everything. And it is much more a package. We know what works is the combination of great teaching with great curriculum, with assessments that are used actually to then inform and adjust teaching in the classroom. And it is that kind of virtuous cycle that has the most profound effect on outcomes.
Okay, thanks. So Laura, let's move to in your perspective. What are you seeing as the big challenges for education financing at the moment?
So picking up a little bit on what Gagi was just saying, and I'm going to focus on low-income countries, middle-income countries where we see the most learning poor children. I think we aren't so far different now than we were before the pandemic in terms of financing. I think the case needs to be made for funding education in the same way today as it did 18 months ago. In that when you talk to someone who's got the money, they're often not from the education sector. They know education, they've been to school, their kids go to school, they've got a daily interaction with the school system, and that comes with a lot of assumptions about what's good and what's not good. I think anyone with children in this room is sitting listening to the last panel thinking, do I play with my children enough? You know, it resonates every day, right? But they don't understand the global education challenge, and they don't understand why it needs so much money and why it's not working. And so over my career, whenever I've had to make a case for increased investment in education, the question comes back, well, show me what's worked. So, I've worked for the last few years in particular on funding research. So we do know an increasing amount about what works. But I think the questions that we're not yet answering, and yet the work of CAMFED and others who are on the ground and driving, is how and why. Because there aren't going to be answers that just work here and then work there. And I think a lot of times that's what we assume, that's what we fund. And then we come up with the reality that learning outcomes aren't rising. So these impossible to give an elevator pitch on issues, our politics, our implementation failure, our the complex, nebulous, messy stuff that are the reality of the children and the teachers and the parents around the world. But the bottom line, I think, is that we need to make a better case. We need to make a better case for why it is that we need to invest in education systems, and why it is that that interventions that we think will work, and that, as we've heard earlier today, there are things that can work, why they're not working. And the bottom line, as I think we started out with this morning, is data on what the problem is. And while I think we in the global education aid community have got fairly fluent at talking about the learning crisis, I don't think that's an accepted reality in an awful lot of places that we work. I don't think parents recognize their kids aren't learning. Parents don't know the data, the trajectories, the detail. We don't have, maybe slightly controversial here, but we don't have the basic learning data that doesn't need to be perfect. There's great work going on to have policy-linked, comparable global scales on learning data. That's not what we need right now. We need learning data that's going to tell us whether or not kids are learning. Most of them pre-pandemic were in school and not learning. So who are they? Why are they not learning? And then we move to the point of what do we do about it and how?
And are you seeing some bright spots nonetheless? I mean, we've talked about kind of the comparison between health and education, of course, the greater difficulty of, the longer time period, the more difficulty measuring outcomes, the debate about what to measure and so on. So what could be a way forward?
So yes, and I think now, even compared to 10 years ago, we have real success stories where we've not only seen interventions, as Gal, you talked about, that work in a non-singular intervention way to raise learning outcomes among groups of children that you would think the system isn't working at all, and yet an intervention can work. What I still don't see enough of is the lessons on what works at scale. And yes, there's some more funding for research in education that gives us the data on whether or not something works at scale, but it comes back to those how and why questions that I don't think we certainly don't have enough examples of interventions that are producing the fundamental learning outcomes, and there's a whole other set of outcomes alongside that. But that's the next step. We still don't have the evidence at scale of how to scale successful education interventions.
And Joe, actually, when you were minister, as I recall, you did a lot to focus on collecting more data, didn't you, for assessment, for example, in higher education outcomes and so on. I don't know if there's anything you can share about your experience there, about how effective it was, what the challenges were, whether there are ways to transfer some of that to other parts of the education sector nationally and globally.
Well, thanks, Andrew. We didn't so much collect new data as try to use some of the existing metrics that were in existence and cobble them together to provide something of a scorecard to measure university performance. And I have to say, it was not very well received as an endeavour. It was known as the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes Framework, and I don't think there's been an initiative that was more unpopular in many a decade, but that is true also, around the world. Whenever policymakers have tried to measure the outcomes of universities and to measure the extent to which there is learning gain and all of these other sort of holy grails that we strive towards, and they tend to be very unpopular and they tend to meet incredible pushback from the sector, and they often end up being defeated, as I fear TEF is in the process of being right now. That's just the fate of efforts to hold the sector to account for its use of public funds, and I think ultimately this is short-sighted on behalf of the sector to resist these attempts to sort of drive some form of accountability, because it ends up in a situation where the end funders start to say, well, hang on a minute, the amounts of public money that we're pouring into this system grow every year, and by the mid-2040s, I'm sure Anna's got a more precise number than I am, but the value of the student loan book will be approaching $500 billion. It's very big bucks indeed, and people do want to see some evidence of a return on that investment, and they do want tangible ways of assessing whether there's value for money in the system. So it's better, in my view, to embrace modest attempts to measure outcomes rather than to resist them wholeheartedly, because you end up with a complete political disconnect with the ultimate funders of your product. That's kind of where we're heading to with the spending review on October the 27th, where the government is keen to, as I was saying in my earlier answer to your question, keen to find resources to pile into FE and skills and other parts of our education system. And when ministers are sitting around the table in the Department for Education and they're wondering where that money's going to come from, they're going to go to the higher education budget, because that's the bit which is really something of a black box and is least politically supported as a result.
Anna, what's your view on data? Do we need more of it? Is it a priority for you?
Perfect question to ask an economist, right? Okay, so I think there are two things here. I will argue strongly, probably against most people in the room, that economists have a key role to play here, because we need people to start seeing spending on education as an investment. And actually, the analogy with health, we were discussing this in the break, is quite interesting here. It's much easier to get money for medicine than it is for public health, which is an interesting, right? So you can get it for the drugs or the immediate response to an epidemic, but you try getting money to work in our region, even very peripherally up behind us, there's a region of which is relatively poor, that there's lots of public health work to do to improve the outcomes of those people. And getting funding to do that, even though that's the investment, that's to prevent bad things happening, is actually really hard. And it's the same in education. But the thing I would take issue with is we have a vast amount of academic research that shows the return on investment in early years schooling. We have a lot of research that shows the benefits of other types of compulsory schooling. We even research on the value of higher education. So we know this, and yet somehow we fail to connect that to trying, in the moment of crisis, not to ask, why should we spend in education, but how can we afford not to? And when we're talking about, I don't want to use the phrase sort of build back better and a high-value economy and high-value jobs and high-skilled jobs, whether that's in the global south or the global north, it requires investment. And I think we've started to sort of drift into a rather UK-focused conversation. But actually, all of these issues are writ large across the globe at the moment. And how serious are we, as the point was made earlier, about investing in the younger generations? Not necessarily just because it's the right thing to do, but because that is the workforce of the future, and that's what's going to make us productive. And, us oldies will rely on that. So this is self-interest as much as altruism, I would say. But that speaks an economist, right? So.
And Gargi, you talked about data early on as being very important. What might be the bright spots there that you're seeing internationally to sort of, engage, collect useful, meaningful, comparable data that's perhaps missing at the moment?
Yeah. Well, let me speak a little bit to the financing as well. As part of the aid philanthropy sector, we like to believe we're important. We're dropping the bucket for education spending, certainly globally. We know this. Governments are the biggest funders of education. Families are the next largest. And we're, maybe 20% of the picture, in some cases as small as 2 or 3%. And so it really makes us think about what's the right role for our kind of resource in this picture. Governments have the hefty job of implementing programming, both the kind of infrastructure, the hard and the soft infrastructure of education programs. So we focus quite a bit on filling data gaps as part of the public good. We'll talk about Edtech. We focus on kind of innovations and the R&D aspects of trying new things. And there, we need to be part of the scaling gap that others have talked about. Sub-Saharan Africa has little or no data on learning outcomes for over half its school-aged children. Impossible to make the case for education without the data to show what's working and why. That we need to fill. There's a lot of enthusiasm around EdTech, making sure we understand what works and why, again, there at the app level, but actually at the system level is another area that I think we're really excited about. And, on the financing front, I think we are in a moment where globally, with the setbacks of COVID, we have been part of many voices encouraging the international community to step back, we've talked about education as a black box, but we actually know enough to act and to invest for good. And so I think we've talked about the UK aid budget that actually has been a huge part of the UK's standing globally around the world is the quality of its ODA support. Equally, IDA is replenishing now, an accelerated replenishment. We have progress on SDR issuance. I think the financing picture is gearing up, has the potential to support a really strong forward motion in this area.
So Laura, perhaps first, we picking up on Gargi's theme on EdTech. Obviously we've seen the power of, in some ways, that's at least saved us from a much worse situation in the pandemic around the world, albeit digital divide and so on being a big concern to equity. But is it a silver bullet, or at least where around the EdTech field is there scope and where room for caution?
So I think part of the problem is that we look for silver bullets and that we look for quick answers. And I think part of the promise and the hope in EdTech is that it provides that sort of, it's alluring, right? Like there is a speed to the promise of EdTech, and there is a promise that it can help both teaching and learning and sort of solve all problems at once. I think there is an increasing amount of knowledge in again context and low income context, learning poor context, that notwithstanding the issues that Grace raised earlier today, the lack of infrastructure, the fundamental there aren't classrooms, let alone internet. I think in a way we need to move back from the question of EdTech, move back from the question of software, hardware that's going to be one of many inputs, right? And I think moving the conversation to be one that is about how do we finance that 10% of capital budget, because 90% is recurrent. There's so much within the education system that is already allocated that goes on teacher salaries, higher education, other things. But within that small amount of the budget, what can we do? EdTech is one of those inputs. And yes, some of the, we do have some really exciting pieces of software that are out there and that are showing really promising results and might change the way that pedagogy is happening, might support the ability to teach every child at the level that they're at. But it is that support to pedagogy. The debate is not whether the EdTech intervention is good or bad. The debate we should be having is what is the problem? Why are kids not learning? And within that 10% of budget, what is it that we need, rather than making the assumption? Now, just a final point on that. The power dynamics that a couple of panelists have brought up today, I think is a big part of that issue, because when you are a Minister of Education with that finite amount of money and you are getting phone calls saying, I've got the answer for you, it's easy to understand why you go with that silver bullet.
Joe, does that resonate as a former minister?
I agree with a lot of what Laura was just saying. I mean, I think, when you look back at the last 20 months, it's clear that hundreds of millions of years of learning have been lost, billions possibly. And the people who've lost most have been those who've been the most technologically disadvantaged, as well as suffering from other forms of disadvantage. But it's been particularly those who've had no infrastructure, hard and soft, around IT. And I think the pandemic has been, has seen the education systems in many countries pass an inflection point in terms of their attitudes to IT and tech generally. Obviously, it varies tremendously from country to country, the experience that people have had. But I think, taking sort of Western developed countries to start with, there was clearly a lot of cultural conservatism in their education systems around the applicability of EdTech solutions to the challenges that they had in teaching and learning, and also some concern that the ethos of EdTech was somewhat at odds with that of the values of the education system as a whole in their countries. I think on both of those fronts, I think we've now been through something of an inflection point, and I think we're reaching a new equilibrium in terms of the relationship with tech. And I think that new equilibrium has been arrived at because of, you know, the forced adoption that many institutions had to go through, that increased familiarity with technologies that they had been holding at arm's length. And that increased familiarity has led to, you know, maintaining levels of usage and increasing levels of penetration. So I think there is something of a virtuous cycle now going on, where a sector that was culturally conservative is becoming more familiar with the tools and the possibilities that Edtech brings to play. Obviously, it's a very different situation in other parts of the world where these tools just simply were a world away from their experience of the pandemic and their understanding of the possibilities that Edtech brings to bear. On Laura's point about, you know, there are exciting things that can be done with the way, you know, we can now focus teaching and learning on the individual and where they are in their own particular sort of journey in a certain subject. I think that's definitely all true. Very, very exciting tools being developed. But there are much simpler ways in which Edtech can be deployed to the real advantage of education systems and their funders. And that's sort of outside the classroom, in the whole sort of panoply of ways in which technology can be used to take pressure off teachers and take pressure off school administrators. All of the software which we now take for granted, for example, about how we organize parents' evenings. You know, we've all been doing, at least those of us who have children, have been doing parents' evenings via a product called School Cloud or any number of other similar products like it, like Microsoft Teams. So we're not going to go back in the vast majority of cases to going to dusty school halls and writing our names on lists and waiting for the teacher to be ready to see us and queuing behind dozens of other parents. That's just simply not coming back. And all of those kinds of changes are here to stay. And I think, you know, that's part of the way in which Edtech is now going to become a much more familiar part of our education systems.
Gaga, you raised the issue of Edtech and the nuances between apps versus systems and so on. So what do you see as perhaps some of the bright spots or the ways forward around Edtech? Where does it have a role, and where are the potential drawbacks or limitations?
Yeah. Well, I certainly agree with others that the pandemic experience has highlighted both the potential and a whole lot of shortcomings, right? So UNICEF estimates that in Africa, 1 in 10 kids can be reached by internet-based learning today. In India, much higher connectivity, but that number is more like 1 in 5. And we saw some very low-tech things work during the pandemic. Radio and in some case TV were channels that were used to, in some cases, good effect to transmit educational materials. Texting and WhatsApp, less so. And that evidence is just starting to come back. But frankly, you know, I think we're not in a moment anymore where we should be debating technology, yes or no. Most governments we work with, as they think about economic recovery and building back better, digital transformation is part of that, whether it's financial inclusion or the backbone of economic systems. It's part of the vision for development. So then it, I think, comes to how do you get this right? And in education would maybe highlight 4 myths to bust about EdTech. One, as others have said, it's not a replacement for the system. It can be part of the system, but it needs to go along with strong curriculum, assessments, teacher training. It's not a shortcut. 2, in and of itself, digital content isn't any more effective as a learning tool. It needs to be combined with the science of learning. And we've all probably seen in our own kids, as well as our work, the difference between content that actually genuinely incorporates sort of pedagogy versus is focused on a sort of user-friendly digital push. Third, I think there's a real myth that that EdTech can somehow leapfrog equity considerations. Not true. These need to be designed to purposefully address equity, whether that's gender or overcoming access issues. And finally, maybe it's true about Parents' Night remaining digital, but I hope school remains real, because as we started out saying, it's also a social structure. And whether you think of it as a place where kids receive supplementary food or engage in part of the community, the act of being in school and part of a school community turns out to be really important to all kinds of outcomes, whether that's child marriage or learning. So that in that context, I think there is the potential for EdTech to actually be a part of the solution.
I know, we'd like to come back to EdTech, and particularly, does it have the potential to reduce or potentially increase inequity?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I agree totally with Joe that the use of technology to help teachers, particularly in the back office functions of schools, is vital. But I think the pandemic taught us a few things. I mean, first of all, the tools that teachers ended up using were developed for commercial purposes and then adapted to the classroom. One of the problems in EdTech is everybody's got their own bespoke system that they're trying to sort of put onto the school system, and that's not great. The second thing is, my day job is funding research, so I'm going to listen to the research. There's good evidence that teaching quality, broadly defined, matters a great deal, and it matters more for low-income children. So square that with, your point, Laura, is EdTech going to be a solution? No. So when we're asking questions about EdTech, it should be, how does it bring about higher quality teaching, not in and of itself. The other thing, just as an aside, we've been talking about access to tech in the Global South, where it's clearly a massive issue, and the laptop solution is almost laughable in some contexts. But I would point out that not only did we discover in the Global North that a significant proportion of kids didn't have access to a device that they could use, but I would say that it was actually easier, I speak as someone who's married to a teacher, to do the teaching from your home to the kids' homes than it was from the schools to the kids' homes. Why? Because schools need kit and IT infrastructure, and given safeguarding and a few other issues that you don't have at home, I'm afraid, it gets tricky. So that's a classic example where it's a great idea to think about technology. We should invest in technology. Is absolutely, you're quite right. We shouldn't be debating whether we have it or not. But when we do that, it also comes back to, have you set the schools up in a way that they can use it effectively, that it doesn't crash in the classroom, that the devices are not wrecked, etc. So I think these things are a little bit of a sideshow, in my view, from the core point, which is, how do we get good quality teaching into a much larger number of classrooms, and particularly the classrooms of the most disadvantaged kids? And you asked about equity. I'm not sure a focus on tech is going to bring about that step change in equity. The hard bit in developed countries is that a targeted investment, i.e. less for rich kids and more for poor, might well do that, but of course it's politically very difficult.
And just answering or pushing back your own question on that, how do we improve teaching then? What would you say is the key?
Okay, so one of the problems and the challenges I think we have, and it's not in every country, so this is one that doesn't apply everywhere, but does apply to most of the settings we've been talking about. There's a problem in the respect that people have for teaching in many countries, teachers, I should say, in some countries, and also the kind of occupation that it is in relative earnings terms, and particularly in terms of sort of the attractiveness of the job. It should be great, it's got long holidays, etc., but there are issues with it. And, those issues are being debated at the moment in the UK, but those issues actually are faced in a large number of other countries. And there's been some interesting work by Peter Dalton and colleagues looking at, which countries hold teachers in high respect. Now, I go on about this not because just giving respect to teachers will make them better teachers and improve their quality of teaching, but because it's symptomatic of a deeper problem. And I think you start with recognizing that if your main input, just like in a commercial organization, your main input is your people, how you treat those people and how they are held to account, but also supported, matters above all else. And I think if we could frame policies, whether it's in the Global North or Global South, about what would this policy mean for the type of person that will be sitting in that classroom, and how well qualified they are, how motivated they are, we would do an awful lot. And I think sometimes teachers and teaching quality is almost an afterthought. And just like we don't expect a silver bullet when it comes to EdTech, to be fair, we can't expect a silver bullet when it comes to intervention X, intervention Y. We're talking about mental health. There's no quick fix here. This is about a systemic change, as you would expect.
I think Edtech can play a big part in addressing one of the biggest challenges facing all education systems, which is, well, particularly in the UK right now, which is our teacher retention crisis. I mean, we've seen, temporarily, I think, a surge in applications for teacher training courses, driven by the sense that teaching is a port in a storm in an uncertain labour market. But when this washes through, I suspect we'll revert to the situation which prevailed prior to the pandemic, whereby we had declining rates of 5-year retention for teachers, reaching really worrying levels in the UK. And when you dig into why teachers are leaving the profession, it's not because they're not passionate about it and they don't love teaching, they do. But more often than not, it's because they feel overwhelmed by the bureaucracy and don't feel in control. They feel simply that there being too many demands being made of their time, and it's becoming completely unmanageable. And I think all of the sort of systems that Edtech, to sort of give them a single label, can help with all of that. Helping them with things like doing the safeguarding forms that they need to fill in to log incidents. All of these can be automated and systematized, helping them take class registers, helping them do class seating plans to optimize learning outcomes in the way that they're seating their pupils, programs to help them timetable, which is an immensely time-consuming part of a teacher's day. All of these burdensome bureaucratic activities which bog teachers' lives down can be improved considerably through sensible use of tech. And I think that's one of the reasons why, coming out of the pandemic, Building Back Better will involve a considerable investment by governments in all of these kinds of technologies to help address some fundamental structural weaknesses around what the lives of our teachers actually looks like.
Laura, so teacher quality and status are a priority for you?
What's the answer to that?
Not at all.
No. Yes, I mean, but I suppose sitting listening to some of the debate, I should caveat by saying I know nothing about the state English system. So all of my experience is low-income country context, and I wasn't educated here. So when I listen to debate and conversation about the UK and the English system, it just strikes me that we're on a different planet in so many ways. We talk about getting teacher quality in the context that I work in, and I am far from the front line. I'm sitting in London, like layers and layers removed, and yet the recommendations that we're making to ministers of education are fix your deployment, your licensing, your recruitment, your training, your teacher training by itself doesn't. I mean, it's enormous. And so in a way, I mean, I always feel like I'm the sort of the negative person in the room, so just reiterating and banging the drum for quite how significant the challenge is. It's not going to be raising learning outcomes, no matter how, almost no matter how much funding we pour in. That £1 billion wouldn't go. Right now, I don't know anyone who would put forward a plan that would say, and this would result in learning outcomes rising at the speed and scale that we need them to, because the challenges are so gargantuan. And in a way, we don't have the answers to thinking about how each system works, which is why it has to come back down to the context and the question of why, the question of how can we test, learn, adapt, as Alicia said earlier, how can we incrementally work out and give demonstration effect to reforms that will build, and again, to come back to CAMFED, this is will build from community up, will empower from community up. And I mean, you can't have education systems, you can't have learning without teachers. But the impatience and the urgency of the task is something that just, I don't think we are talking about building back better in a lot of these contexts, because it couldn't get much worse.
And I mean, obviously, it's not just simply about relative salaries of teachers. We know systems where teachers have a higher status, even if they're not terribly well paid. Any brighter spots, at least in some of the countries that you're looking at, where, despite the economic hardship or the relatively low level of remuneration, the profession of teaching does manage to attract and retain high-quality teachers that might be a model for elsewhere?
I mean, there's bright spots everywhere all the time, right? I mean, teachers are going into classrooms and teaching without pay, without housing. I mean, this is another point, I guess, that we've talked a little bit today about the cross-sector needs and thinking about mental health of teachers and so forth. The cross-government policies that need to be in place to support teachers. We're not just talking about education budgets here. There's the lives of all of these individuals who are still turning up in classrooms and who are still teaching and doing the best that they can require such comprehensive, multi-directional change that it's not just a conversation that we in education should be having.
Okay, well, let's open it up, and a reminder also for people online to post your questions, please, and I'll try to come to them. I think, first of all, I'm going to turn to Eric Hanushek, if he's Eric around somewhere. Where is he? There he is. Who indeed, congratulations as the other Yidan laureate. We should congratulate you on your efforts. I think, do we need a mic? Yeah.
My comment or question is that we often confuse just resources and investment as resources as opposed to the underlying structure and the things that are needed to, in fact, get the things moving. And that discussion, I think, is confusing to the politics of everything, because whenever we talk about what are we going to do about solving the pandemic problem, we turn to, well, how much money should we put into it? And that's the debate in the United States and elsewhere, and that's just the wrong debate. And so I guess there's a question if people agree. Laura's at least nodding her head, but that's what I find to be the most difficult problem here, that we do have to fix our schools in many countries, particularly after the pandemic, but we can't get the debate going about the kinds of fixing that we need.
So great honour to come back to a question from Rick Hanushek, who did the piece of work that I modelled my PhD on. So there you go. It's lovely to see you, Rick. It's of course the right question. Resources are not the same as solutions, and one of the reasons why we might be looking at a degree of cynicism from some policymakers about investment in education is precisely because we spent a lot of money and not always produce results. I mean, Joe's comments about higher education being the example. I mean, we might point to, the vaccine and other great highlights that higher education has produced, but particularly on the research front, but also the teaching. But nonetheless, there's a slight sense that we always ask for more money and we don't come up with specifics as how it should be spent. And so that brings us to the What Works movement. I mean, we've heard a number of speakers today on this panel and before talk about interventions and what works. Absolutely vital that we have robust evaluation evidence of what works. These are the sort of building blocks of whatever solution we come up with. But I think then the missing bit that I'm sure we economists probably put our hands up to are thinking about system change and how that actually happens. If I have a sort of number of interventions that might be effective, how can I put them together in such a way that the money doesn't get diverted, that the right people are in the classrooms? How do you do nebulous things like build trust between teachers, politicians, and teachers, politicians, and the people with the money? How can you build that trust so that you can actually feel like when you're doing something, it's actually going to produce a result? And that's incredibly messy. But if you take a step back and say, and how would we do that? I think it comes back to the conversation in the first panel, I think it was Julia. Basically, you can't do this remotely from, I don't know where the UN is headquartered these days, but New York, Washington, London. It can't be done like that, because you have to understand the flaws, the weaknesses, and the strengths of the system before you. And so actually what we need to think about is how would we get in a scenario where we could invest, have sufficient resource, trust the relative, the country to spend it, which is the big issue, and then actually have a system analysis that tells us where the weaknesses are. That's what we need to do, and it's really hard. So that's not.
You obviously shot Joe. No, I know he had to leave. But Gargi, do you want to come back as well on Eric's point?
Yeah, sure, and congratulations as well. Yeah, so absolutely agree. Resources are not the same as solutions. But they do matter. There are very few circumstances, either in our domestic U.S. education work or international, where we think the financing system is designed now in the best possible way. Does money flow to the schools most in need? In the US, that's a complex dynamic of local politics and local taxation systems. Internationally, I'd be hard-pressed to say that sufficient financing is flowing into the education sector. And I think funding has the benefit of coming with attention, and that's super important for us, because then we can use the attention that goes along with funding to start having the conversation about solutions, how you use that funding well, how you report on outcomes. That is part of the change dynamic we're aspiring for. And then fully agree, we do need to, and I think we have evidence on what works that should help policymakers, decision makers allocate resources. It's not perfect. There's a lot of noise in the data, but there is a pathway. And then we need to make sure there's accountability for funding, so that there is a sort of feedback loop, and funding gets, there's course corrections based on outcomes. So I think it is part of the ecosystem of change.
So I think something that I've been growing more and more enthusiastic about, I guess, in recent years, is the idea that we need to work differently in at least the global education aid architecture. And I think providing support to approaches that enable local level cycles that are data driven, but that demonstrate whether something within the What Works Bible works in a particular context, doesn't respond to the reason kids aren't learning, understands what it is that people are wanting out of their education, but is very much problem and person driven and then iterated. And I think providing that kind of support is a direction that more of us should be going in. And many are starting to go in that direction, which I think is exciting. And I think there's a sort of almost sort of a step change that can happen there. On the flip side, I think having at the start of my career seen a real surge in collaboration among aid actors towards principles of aid effectiveness and so forth, I think in recent years that's fallen away. And I think the sort of parallel to in-country approaches and changes of how we support things, I think at the global level we must collaborate and work more closely together, build on each other's efforts, and make our investments more than the sum of their parts. And networks, I'm here representing a network of education philanthropists who are it's set up to do that. And I think I'm seeing more and more groups and working groups and networks and a real desire to collaborate and to share information. But at the same time, when I go to country, when I talk to colleagues in country, there's an awful lot of disconnect and fragmentation. And I think this is a tiny part of the solution. But I think alongside resources, there's behaviour and practice.
Okay, thanks. Other questions, please? Over there, please. Yeah, front row.
Hi there, Adam Barton with the Faculty of Education and the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. So I wanted to dive a little bit farther into what I think everyone is articulating excitingly on implementation and localization and making things work in practice. And I'm curious then, if I hear everyone sort of agreeing on the idea that funders can and should indeed focus more and more on implementation, localization, take up on the ground, what is missing in the infrastructure today that is perhaps precluding that sort of money focus? And what incentives would need to be put in place for that to be a real, genuine kind of practice across all funders that you work with?
Great question, and I think there's a lot getting in the way of that. Number one, I don't think you want to have 100 different funders getting into debate about a particular local community and weighing in. You know, the sort of direct level funding, even the debate that we see around national donor groups is too fragmented. There's also then those power dynamics that we spoke about early this morning. You can't, I think there are increasing numbers of projects and interventions that are set up in a way that don't engage with the power dynamics of that particular government. And when I say government, I don't just mean national government. I think we translate often system and sector to mean national level, but local government and the incentives and relationships that drive them and their work. So if I were to pick the two big things, that would be it.
So I think this is an interesting point about interdisciplinarity as well. I wonder whether there's more that we could learn from some of the challenges that public health has experienced. Got an expert in the room, he can give us a thought on that. But I do think that we know that when it comes to working holistically to try and get system change, that's where we get the most difficulty. Now, as given my background, what I would say is what is often missing is decent evaluation. You wouldn't think that to hear what we're talking about today, but we've got a very select group of people in the room, and they've been talking about evaluation and what works. But out there in the wider world, and particularly, definitely across the global north, there's a huge amount of activity, and it's not clear what it's doing, and it's not evaluated properly. And then going back to something Joe said, the more you shove into that classroom, the more stress you put on teachers and the problems of, trying to, and that does apply global north and global south. So we do need to take stuff away. We need to be clear that when we're implementing things, it's actually for a reason and we know whether it works at the end of it and remove it if it doesn't. And then I guess, the Marxist amongst us would say that the political economy of all this matters, right? The power, as you rightly say, it's the power relations, but it's more than that. Following the money is part of the issue in the education system across the world, and that's a problem, I think, because it tends to lead to fads. It tends to lead to enthusiasms for interventions rather than steady investment. And the big problem underlying it all is we also want the results to be next year. And, education's a long-term game, so that's a real problem.
At least before the end of the next election cycle, yes.
I'm saying nothing.
Gargi?
Well, I agree with everything Laura and Anna said. Maybe I'll add a different point, which is, we have found both in our US Ed work and globally that education outcomes are really about a sort of life cycle of interventions. They are sort of critically linked to what happens in the classroom, but as we said before, they start from kind of where the mom in particular is in terms of safety, nourishment, health, ability to plan families and timing of children. Then there's the quality of primary education, and super importantly, that transition to secondary education is when supported by after-school programs, by community programs for girls. And I'm partial. I served on the US board of CAMFED for many years, and that's a great example of one. But having moms in women's collectives, we know, means that girl children are less likely to have to take time off school to babysit younger siblings. And so this is really hard for both the aid community, which likes to specialize in our verticals, and it's also hard for governments because this is cross-ministerial action. And so I'm quite excited by the sort of the bringing together of silos, the programs we are starting to see in countries on sort of integrated programming for women or for holistic kind of child outcomes, because we know that's what it takes. There's a sort of reinforcing effect across those interventions.
Okay, thanks. I think there's a question there, please.
I want to go back to the question of justifying education spending, particularly in the global south. Very important, it seems to me, to distinguish between making the case at system level and at intervention level, because quite different considerations come in. I actually think it's extraordinary that we're still needing to make the case for system-level spending. All we need to do is look at what happens in countries where there's a very small proportion of GDP spent on education. The outcomes speak for themselves. If we look at what the global elite want and spend on their own children's education, that's a pretty powerful case. So it is extraordinary that we still need to make the case at system level, but we still need to do. But these are not the arguments that will come from when we look at interventions. In a way, it's like looking at lifeboats and the ship. It's great. It's actually quite important to have good lifeboats. But if there's a load of holes in the ship, the lifeboats don't matter. You want the best lifeboats in the business, but unless people accept, or unless we and others make the case for a proper level of expenditure, perhaps in terms of percentage of GDP, the other stuff is really like the lifeboats.
Anna, do you want to come up?
No, I mean, that's an excellent point. I mean, at some level, this is an area that we have a very comprehensive research evidence base on. So if you're trying to think about system level returns, now, okay, most of it's measured in terms of productivity and earnings. These seem pretty important to an economist. They're not everything, though. We could measure it in terms of health. We could measure it in terms of how people participate in democracies and all sorts of different outcomes from education. So we could spread that evidence base a little bit broader to take in a broader range of outcomes. But the core of it shows very clearly the value of education, however you define that. So there's no problem evidencing the productive and economic value of education. But I think you go from there to, okay, and now what should we do? And at that point, it becomes less about system-level justification and more about the specifics of interventions or things. Now, I mean, we were talking in the break about the fact that many politicians in global north and global south have got on board with the fundamental principle for which there is a lot of evidence, which is investment in early years is hugely important and highly beneficial. Now, that's a nice example where that's sort of a systems level piece of evidence, but at the same time, it's specific enough to give actionable policy, right? And I think we need a bit more of that, as well as good evidence on the very small intervention blocks that you're talking about, which is vital, but doesn't get you to the place where you can actually say we should be spending X% of GDP on education.
I want to squeeze in a couple more questions. There's one online here from Dorothy Gordon. So we've yet to carry out real evaluation of the impact of Edtech on learning outcomes. There's real and obvious dangers in major tech companies being in charge of content and data. So how do we localize our Edtech? Laura, do you want to come in on that?
Maybe to put my former hat on, the UK government has funded, together with the Gates Foundation, an Edtech hub, which is funding for robust research into Edtech interventions in the global south. So there is, I mean, funding for research is one piece of the puzzle, but I think there is more, and indeed even through some of the education funding that is not Edtech specific, there is more and more data coming out. I think there's now a task to pull some of that together.
Gargi, do you want to come back on that as well?
I want to come back on a related point across the two questions on how do we make the case for investing in the system or indeed interventions that work. You know, I think it was Anna who said this is a unique audience, and even the airtime we've spent on evaluations and evidence-based policymaking. You know, a huge part of my job is trying to get the evidence out there for investments in health and education, et cetera. And evidence-based political prioritization is even harder than evidence-based policymaking. The analogy to preventive health is a great one, I think, because it is any sort of preventive investment is hard to justify, especially those that have years and years until they show outcomes. So this is a human capital challenge. It's a pandemic preparedness challenge. I will say the one thing we have found to be ever more powerful than us showing up with great evidence is citizens expressing what they want, and how we build a grassroots and domestic constituency that cares about education and is willing to say that, I think is the cutting edge of how we make the case. We know from Afrobarometer, any number of surveys, that education for kids is something parents prioritize really in this sort of top set of what they hope their government will deliver. How we empower citizen voices to express this as a priority, I think, needs to be a part of making the case.
Thanks. Might be something that Boris also wants to reflect on. Perhaps in your closing, I would put you on the spot now, but the whole public health intervention space is a really interesting one.
Health interventions in general. If I want to get a health story out, I will find a 10-year-old who needs a second liver transplant to get on the front pages of the Daily Mail. It's emotive. Everybody responds to it. Public health, until there's a crisis, struggles for it. But we have outcomes, and we commonly call them the body bag count. You get it every day with COVID, how many people have died of COVID. Everybody relates to it. Our outcome measures, the data that we have for education, they're very good. They're very reasoned, but they don't have the same impact with the public. You know, the reading age at 10 and how many are reading at 10, that sounds a million miles removed from the primary school down the road. I wouldn't send my dog there if they couldn't read by the age of 10. People don't relate to the outcomes that are really important. So I do think there's a very important area in defining those outcomes. Julia used one, maternal health related outcomes. Those are uniform because actually they've been funded internationally to make sure they're uniform, and therefore they're comparable, and therefore they get messages across. And it's not enough just to find the outcome. You've got to find the funding to ensure that there is a global uniformity in those measures, which in country you can't do in the developing South because you haven't got the resources to funnel into getting data, when in reality you've got the day job of trying to educate a large mass of children. And I think that's a fundamental problem. And don't equate public health with education, because it's extremely difficult to draw the parallels between the two, because one has got a very firm set of objectives which everybody relates to, and the other are rather more nebulous, I'm afraid.
Well, although it's interesting, isn't it? Because actually the one parallel with prevention early stage in health is there's also the other form of negative intervention, the syntaxes and the regulation. I wonder if there are any areas in education that one could look at that as a different form of control or revenue raiser as opposed to an active intervention. But I'm afraid, I'm sorry we haven't had time to get to everybody's questions, but I see Julian hovering.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, we could continue this conversation for a while, but we have one relatively short break before the final session. And so I will have to just say thank you very much to all of you, to Andrew, to Laura, to Anna, and welcome back to Jesus. It's great to have you. Gagi, thank you for being here, and to Joe, who had to run off to catch a taxi. So thank you all very much. Please. And please do come back within 10 minutes so that we can start the final session promptly. Thank you.